So similar to the transfer of eggs or organs or something, adoption agencies don't technically sell babies because that would be illegal and highly frowned upon. But there's been the growth of a new industry that connects couples to pregnant women who might put their babies up for adoption. So it's kind of a fine line between adoption and adoption services lead to a child and buying a child technically, because sometimes in some cases some of these parents pay considerable money for contact with a woman or a couple who might be putting their baby up for adoption. Another ethical issue is the paid surrogacy, and there are a couple of cases that have caused or have led to questions about the ethics of it. So when we think about and what we've talked about, the fertilization of the embryos outside of the womb has made it possible for another woman to gestate an embryo to birth, and that created what we call today as the surrogate mothers. In 1986, there were several hundred women who had helped infertile women gestate babies. There was a famous case back at that time. A pediatrician named, actually, it was a married couple of pediatricians, Bill and Elizabeth Stern, and they hired Mary Beth Whitehead for $10,000 to gestate an embryo created by his sperm and Whitehead's egg through artificial insemination. She gave birth in 1986, and she claimed to have bonded with the baby that they called Melissa and refused to give her to the parents. When he threatened legal action, she fled to Florida with the baby, but was discovered and returned back to New Jersey where they were. So her case, the whole situation there, and what she did for surrogacy is called a traditional surrogacy. It was her egg. Most cases today are gestational surrogates, and the carrier does not contribute any eggs partly because of this case. So this case went to trial in 1987, and the judge then upheld the contract and said it wasn't baby selling. The Whitehead was required to hand the baby over, and she was awarded $10,000, saying she could never see the Whiteheads again. But the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 1998, so we're talking now several years later, reversed that decision and declared Mrs. Whitehead the legal mother with full visiting rights and invalidated the surrogacy contract. So later on in life, she became a critic, pretty outspoken critic against surrogacy. Ultimately, the baby graduated from George Washington University, and she wrote her master's thesis also, ironically, on the topic of children of surrogacy. There was another famous surrogacy case, J.C. Buzanka, who was called or known as the child with five parents. And she was born in 1995 from a paid surrogate who became embroiled in a divorce between the would-be parents of J.C. J.C. was conceived from a sperm and an egg other than from the parents who hired the surrogate. And ultimately, the California Appeals Court ruled that the parents who hired the surrogate had to be responsible for J.C. There was another famous case in 2013. A surrogate named Crystal Kelly refused to abort a fetus that had a severe heart defects. She had a cleft palate, a cyst in the brain. There were multiple surgeries after birth, and the surgeons told the prospective parents that the baby would have only about a 25% chance of a normal life. The couple that had hired Kelly paid $22,000 for the surrogacy contract, but the contract contained a clause required her to get an abortion in the case of what they called gross defects of the fetus. They offered her an additional $10,000 for the abortion, but she refused. They sued her, and they sued her to get back the money that they had already paid her, and they refused to be the legal parents of the child. Kelly continued on with the pregnancy, gave birth in Michigan, and in Michigan at the time, surrogacy contracts couldn't be enforced. The baby was born with multiple disabilities. She had a brain that didn't the two hemispheres of the brain didn't connect. Some of her organs had developed in the wrong places. A Michigan couple ended up adopting her. She had many surgeries, all paid by Medicaid at the University of Michigan Medical Center. So she was on public assistance and ended up being paid. Being covered by public assistance. One thing I included in here is something that's really relatively new called three-parent babies. And there's a startup company called Darwin Life, and it's using a controversial fertility technique to help people who are over 40 be able to get pregnant. And he's doing it at a bargain of only $100,000. So what he's doing is he's using this technique where he's shifting the DNA of an older woman into the egg of a younger woman, so that the older mother will have some biological connection to the baby. And his clinic is called New Hope Fertility Center. And originally, this technology was used to, or the intent was to prevent women from passing rare diseases on to their children. But now it's being used more for this purpose. So he's offering this service to women between the ages of 42 and 47, which, as we've already talked about, is when the ability to have a child either by in vitro fertilization or naturally are declining. So I'm click on this article. I just gave you a brief overview of what it is. So read that. But they're called three-parent babies because you've got the younger woman's egg. You've got the older woman who's having some of her DNA injected into the egg, and then the father's being fertilized by the father's sperm. So three-parent babies. So before we had Octomom, Nadia Suleiman, and the Goslins, there were cases of multiple births that were less successful than the ones that we've heard about. And those really grew steadily after the Louise Brown birth in 1978. So at the time, it was very expensive for in vitro fertilization, much more harder to get. So many women or many couples that didn't have the ability, weren't getting reimbursed for that in vitro fertilization, they were taking the drugs for that super ovulation to overcome infertility. And they were, in many cases, some highly potent drugs. So when they released all of these eggs and they're being fertilized by the sperm, your sperm can fertilize 1, 2, or 8 eggs, and it can result in multiple births, twins, triplets, and even more. Whereas with in vitro fertilization, it allows doctors to be able to control how many embryos are implanted, with the ideal implantation being 1 embryo per cycle. There was some cases that aren't as famous as the ones we've heard about. A Mormon couple in 1985 conceived of septuplets, but refused to have the reduction. 4 of their 7 babies died, and the 3 survivors had severe disabilities, including cerebral palsy. Then there was the Helms of Illinois. They had quintuplets that were born 11 weeks early. 1 child spent a year in the NICU. Another one had seizures. A third had cerebral palsy. And the medical bills for the first 10 years of life, now this was in 1987, so imagine what it would be now, but the first 10 years of their lives was $3 million, and that was paid by the Children's Miracle Network, mostly. So, when it comes to multiple birth babies, they are almost always premature. They often weigh less than 2 pounds each. They have 3 times the likelihood of having severe disabilities at birth, and they typically are going to spend months in the NICU. Within the womb, particularly during the gestational period, the nutrients in oxygenated blood are scarce. So not all of the fetuses are likely to emerge healthy when you have these multiples. So to prevent the disabilities resulting from this uterine deprivation, doctors will recommend having that selective reduction to leave only one or two embryos. But again, it gets to the ethical issue for the parents of destroying life. Another case that's a little bit more famous is 1997, the McCaughey's, and they also used the medications for superovulation. Ended up conceiving of 7 embryos. They also refused to reduce, and they chose to risk having children with disabilities, claiming that any bad results would be God's will. They did have the babies by the 4th birthday. All of the children lagged in development. They still weren't potty trained by the time they were 4. One of them had seizures. One had spastic diplegic CP, required lots of medical treatments. Another one had quadriplegic CP, many surgeries. One of them had an indwelling feeding tube. So really, the majority of these children had severe disabilities that required extensive medical care. So they don't really talk about this a whole lot when we talk about the multiples birth, but in general, the majority of them have severe disability because the probability of having an impaired baby varies directly with the number of embryos that are allowed to gestate. So the more embryos they implant and gestate, the higher the likelihood that these children are going to have disabilities. So basically, if 6 are implanted, 1 is almost certain to be born with cerebral palsy or be blind. And then the chance of having any baby at all with assisted reproduction also varies with the number of embryos implanted. So that leads to the ethical issue of how many should be implanted. Went too far, so I'm going to end this one for now.